connecting to NFS storage. I think this nugget's going to be really short, and most of the reason for that is because a lot of what we've already talked about we've already done a lot of the connecting to various types of storage, so some of the processes are going to be very similar to what you've seen before. What's different, however, is how NFS actually functions, and actually setting it up on the other side to be able to enable opening up that port and opening up that connection so that it can be exported out to your ESX server. What is NFS storage? NFS storage is been around in the Unix world for a long, long time. It's network file storage, and it is a way of having a Unix server or a Linux server enable an export, what's called an export, so that another system can come in and actually connect into that location, that directory on that Unix server, and add, remove data from it. You can do it read only, you can do it read write. It's very similar to a Windows file share, but it's the Unix or the Linux version of this capability for doing file sharing. Now, in a lot of cases, you're probably not going to use NFS storage as a big deal for hosting VMs, unless you have a need for very, very low performing VMs, because NFS storage has a pretty high overhead associated to it. Most of the data stores we've talked about thus far, including Fiber Channel and iSCSI, all of them are a lot of times on dedicated devices. And unlike, very different from that is NFS, because NFS is already sitting on top of a very fat operating system. And so it already has a sense of the operating system's overhead that you have to deal with in order to be able to use it. Now, we're actually in this nugget, we're going to configure the Linux NFS daemon using the OpenFiler VM that we created in the last nugget. And then we're going to connect our ESX server into that NFS daemon so that we can show how you can create a data store that can be accessed by multiple hosts. Now, the question you're probably asking then is, if I'm going to be using NFS, or if I have the ability to use NFS, then and you're telling me that's not a great one to use, and why would I want to use it? Let's look at it again. Remember the couple of different storage options that we have for us. First of all, at the very, very top, we have fiber channel storage. And really, and there's some argument about this, but fiber channel storage is arguably some of the fastest storage on the market right now. It's the fastest drives. Using fiber channel drives really speeds up things in the drive subsystem. Somewhere down between those two is the concept of DAS drives and also iSCSI drives. And iSCSI and DAS drives are kind of like that second tier storage. DAS drives are typically SCSI. They're usually 10 to 15,000 RPM, and they're usually local, so you don't have to go over a network connection to get to the drives. You're only going at bus speed. So DAS drives can arguably be relatively fast as well. iSCSI drives are typically very fast, and some of the higher end iSCSI arrays, those drives are very high speeds. But iSCSI has that problem with the connection, the copper connection that connects it into the array. So it's kind of like a lower tier storage to fiber channel. And at the very bottom here, we have this concept of NFS. One very, very good use of NFS is for the storage of these ISO images that we keep talking about. And really, whenever you move into virtualization, you're going to find that you're going to be creating lots and lots of these ISO images, because it's a pain in the neck to have to go into the data center and drop a CD into a drive. And if you're using the virtual infrastructure client, you have the ability of mapping your CD from your local machine so it connects into the server, but it is intolerably slow in order to do that unless you're a very fast connection. And if that connection's way on the other side of a WAN, it's essentially impossible to use. So what you find yourself doing in a lot of cases is wrapping up a lot of your CDs into ISO files, and then you need to put them somewhere. Now, the big problem with doing that is the different types of drives that you have available to you also have a cost associated to them. Those fiber channel drives are pretty spendy, right? And those iSCSI drives, are a little bit less so. And then those DAS drives they're already in the server anyway. But with DAS drives, it's not shared storage, so you don't have the option for shared storage. If you may have to put those CD ISO images in multiple locations if you store them in a local data store. Now, NFS kind of solves a lot of those problems, because NFS can leverage your existing drive space, either on a Linux box or a Unix box or even a Windows box if you use services for Unix. So you can use your existing Linux installations, you can use your existing Unix installations, or you can use FSFU for Windows as a location for storing those CD images. Those are all available to you as part of NFS. So let's move away now from this description of what NFS is, and let's actually show how we would configure it so that we can make it available and create a data store in our ESX environment that connects into an NFS infrastructure. So let me go ahead and minimize this, and we've got our virtual infrastructure client here, our VIC already set up for our connection to ESX Nugget 1, and we've already created two data stores here. We've got our local data store, that's the storage 1 data store, and then we we created in the last nugget this iSCSI connection to this higher level iSCSI or a higher performing iSCSI data store. Now what we want to do first of all is we want to go to the configuration tab, and then we want to see first of all that there is no such thing really as a storage adapter for NFS. The NFS connection is nothing more than a daemon that runs on the virtual server, on the ESX server, that connects into the daemon that's on the NFS server. So we have to have a client, and ESX provides that client for us as part of the Linux infrastructure that it's built on. And so in order to have this, we've got our storage right here, and to create that connection to the storage, all we need to do really is click this Add Storage button, and you'll see as we've gone here before, we have an immediate connection for creating a connection to network file system. Now, we haven't done anything yet. We haven't actually created an NFS share yet. We need to do that first for us to be able to connect to it on the ESX side. So let's actually go into our OpenFiler operating system. Let's go to the console of our OpenFiler operating system, log into it, and create the export that we need to create in order to open up this availability for this NFS storage. So now I'm going to minimize the VIC again, and now we're back into our VMware workstation. I don't know, that kind of gives you a great example of the VM and a VM idea, right? And you'll see we have our OpenFiler powered on, and we have the console showing up here. This is our OpenFiler log on. I'm going to go ahead and log in with root, and I'm going to do the password that I chose for root. And you'll see that I have your typical Linux logon configuration right here. Now what we're looking for is a file called etc exports. Now, if there is an existing etc exports, then you'll be able to look at it. If there's not one, then you'll need to create it. And you can create it or even edit the one that's existing by typing vi etc exports. If you like the VI editor, if you want to use a different one like Nano or Emacs or whatever your preferred editor is, you can use that. But you need to actually create this etc/exports location. Once you've opened up your editor, the way that you create an export is by enumerating it inside of this file. So what I'm going to do, I've already created a file called, called home nugget lab. This is the name of the file that we've created. This is a file inside of the directory called home called nugget lab, and that's a directory called nugget lab. And what we're doing is we're exporting this directory so we can make it available. The next thing that we need to do is we need to tell it which machines that we want it to be able to connect to. In our case, it's 192.168.0.101/24. So it's the 24-bit subnet mask associated with 192.168.0.101. Once we're through that, then we do an open parenthetical and we say, okay, we have a couple of options that we want to create for this export. The first one is we want to make sure it's read-write. So we say RW for read-write. Another thing we want to do is no root squash. This is a good setting so that we don't actually remap incoming root connections into anonymous root connections. And then sync is another connection that we want to make sure that we say in there, so we enable the sync capability. So this is all we need to do to enable home/nugget lab, this particular directory on our Linux server, to connect to the remote location 192.168.0.1. Now I'm going to go ahead and save this file here. We're going to go WQ bang to save the file. I can do cat etc exports to make sure I did it correctly. Again, we see that home nugget lab, and there's our location as well. The next thing we need to do is actually restart the NFS service. And so we can do service NFS restart to tell NFS, okay, go ahead and restart yourself, and when you come back up, make available that location. You'll see here we haven't got any terrible errors. We got an error here, but that's not one that we're really worried about at this point. So now that we've restarted the service with this in our etc exports location, we can actually make use of it inside of our virtual infrastructure client. So I'm going to go back to my VIC here, and now that I've done it on the Linux server side, I need to add the storage on the ESX side so that I can make the connection. When I do this, I make the connection, and at the same time I also create a data store on that connection as well. I'm going to click next here, and I need to give it a server name. I'm going to do 192.168.0.105, which is the IP address for our OpenFiler server, and in the folder I want is home nugget lab. The data store name is going to be nugget lab _ NFS. If I click next here and then finish, it's going to take it a second while it enumerates the connection, it makes the connection, it creates the data store, and then if we have a successful creation, we should see it show up here in our storage location. And you'll see now that if I scroll this to the right, you'll see we have a device 192.168.0.105 :/home/nugget lab. We now have the connection that we need in order to be able to drop data onto that data store. If I wanted to, I could potentially create another virtual machine just like I did previously, and instead of choosing one of the other data stores for my location for this virtual machine, I can now choose this nugget lab underscore NFS as the location for my virtual machine. I can very easily drop virtual machines on there and run them off of that NFS share, but again, it's not going to be terribly high performing. Now, there is one thing that we need to make sure, and we didn't talk about this in the last nugget, but we want to make you aware of it in case you're doing any sort of firewalls inside of your ESX server. If we click down here on the security profile link in our configuration tab, we want to make sure that if we're using NFS, and also if we're using iSCSI connections, for those to properly work through our firewall, we need to make sure that we enable the NFS client and also the iSCSI client. This is something that we didn't do last time, but we needed to do. So you'll see both of these. It allows us the outbound ports. It allows outbound traffic to leave our ESX server and connect into the remote server for the purposes of making an iSCSI or an NFS connection. If you have problems where you're finding, well, I just can't seem to connect to, for some reason, I'm having problems connecting into things, you'll want to make sure that you enable these connections, either the iSCSI client for an iSCSI connection or the NFS client for an NFS connection, so that you have the firewall opened up for the purposes of actually making the connection. In a follow-on nugget, actually towards the end of this series, we're going to go into more detail about the service console and the Linux commands that you really are going to want to know in order to best administer your virtual infrastructure environment. And once you actually create these data stores, whether it's an NFS data store or it's a data store that's local onto the disk, or even if it's a shared store, an iSCSI or fiber channel connection, once you've created the data stores, you can actually go into the service console and manipulate the files through the Linux commands. And we'll talk about that in a later nugget, but we promised that this would be a very short nugget, and we're doing just that. So what have we talked about today? We talked about NFS, and we showed that from the Linux side how you can configure it to set it up. We talked about what is NFS storage and why you'd want to use it. We talked about how it's really a good idea for ISO files and for files that you want to make available to all the servers in your data store if you want to have one nice common location for them. We also talked about why it's probably not a good idea if you want to host virtual machines off of it, because those virtual machines are not going to probably perform as well as you want them to, unless they're lower end virtual machines that don't require a lot of resources. We showed how to configure the Linux NFS daemon. We showed how easy it was. You create the export, then you restart the NFS daemon, then bam, you're ready to go. And then lastly, we connected ESX to NFS. We went into the ESX console and we made that connection, making sure that we set the firewall appropriately so that we wouldn't get blocked by that firewall whenever we attempted to make the connection. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.